A warm welcome to our panelists and attendees of the webinar using traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction from words to action, held as part of ICCROM lecture series and in collaboration with UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm pleased to introduce myself, Rohit Jigyasu, Project Manager at ICCROM. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, ICCROM, the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, is the intergovernmental organization working in service of its 137 member states for promoting conservation of all forms of heritage in every region of the world. So the theme of this webinar, traditional knowledge, is very important for us, and especially for disaster risk reduction, because traditional knowledge develops through close relationship of communities with their environment. Communities have learned to read the signs and have learned to read the signs of the sea, the skies, and the wildlife to predict hazards. Direct experience with disasters has taught many communities the duration, location, time, frequency, intensity, onset, and possible behavior of the hazards linked to these events. Likewise, traditional technologies and construction practices often reflect adaptations to the environmental conditions. These technologies that have evolved through trial and error are often very resilient because of the traditional knowledge that has enabled these technologies to manage local hazards and use local materials. There are many examples of survival of traditional buildings during disasters caused by earthquakes, floods, cyclones, tsunami, and other hazards because of the traditional knowledge embedded in them. Traditional knowledge is also communicated through intangible heritage, such as traditional performing arts or folklore or local management systems. Indigenous social, economic, and institutional coping skills and capacities are also inherent part of traditional knowledge systems. In every society, there are a variety of internal social structures that help individuals and families through difficult periods. These coping mechanisms become collective instruments for organizing action on behalf of victims for disaster mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. However, rather than merely rediscovering traditional knowledge, we need to find practical ways of adapting it to contemporary context and mainstreaming it as part of disaster risk management practice. This webinar aims to show examples that demonstrate the application of traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction in various contexts. It is based on the Words into Action implementation guide on this topic that is currently under development as a joint initiative of ICCROM and UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. We are indeed privileged to be joined today by our esteemed panelists who through their presentations will present various case studies and bring out various issues to illustrate how traditional knowledge can be used for disaster risk reduction in present context. So I am delighted to introduce you to our panelists today, and I will request them to turn on their videos. Thank you. Mr. Dev Zervas from UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, Dr. Robert Sakik Trogle from King's College London, Professor Takeyuki Okubo from Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Dr. Ebru Genzer from the Center for Urban Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience, Professor Elena Isayev from Exeter University, UK, and last but not the least, Dr. Marjorie Balayas from Indigenous Kankanai community in Philippines. Thank you again, all of you, for joining this webinar, and we are really eager to listen to you. Before I proceed further, may I apprise you of some procedures for housekeeping during the webinar. You can send your queries and comments via Q&A icon that you see at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will take up some questions after the presentations by our panelists. In case we are unable to answer all the questions due to shortage of time, please do send us email and we'll surely get back to you. So let me have the privilege of firstly inviting Mr. Dev Zarvas, a program manager at UNDRR, or UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Dave has been, in fact, instrumental in initiating Words into Action implementation guide on using traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction. So I'm very happy that Dave has agreed to join us, and floor is yours, Dave.
Thank you very much, Roy. A pleasure to be here. Greetings to all. And as you already pointed out, Rohit, traditional knowledge is extremely important to use, to discover, to rediscover for a lot of areas of knowledge in the world, for a lot of things we should be doing these days. And of course, especially so in the area of disaster risk reduction. Why, if we would have to say in a few words, why traditional knowledge is so important and needed in DRR, in disaster risk reduction? We can be very, very clear about that. We lose so incredibly much if we do not use that knowledge that comes from different sources, from different traditional sources, indigenous sources, local knowledge sources. You have to remind that many sources of traditional knowledge are precisely based on cognitive schemes that favor a very special, careful, integrative, and a more holistic observation. This very often also goes together with an attitude that's more holistic in general and more open to experience a whole wide gamut of perception and thought processes, and also social means of getting more deeply and more connected with knowledge. This, of course, doesn't mean that everything that is in traditional knowledge is always of the same value or usefulness, but there is a lot that we can discover, adapt for use, and make sure that it forms part of the future ways of doing disaster risk reduction. And this is acknowledged in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, I would just refer to the Sendai framework, otherwise there's too many words. Tradition mentions traditional knowledge in many instances. It is recognized it's extremely important to work with, to rediscover and to apply. And it's also recognizing that it's not used at all today to its maximum potential, not even maybe to its minimum potential yet, because there's so much more to be done. And just for your reference, because it's important to see how this reflects itself in such an important international framework as the Sendai framework, I'll just read a few parts where this is explicitly mentioned. Not all parts, because it would take too long, but let's go to a few. DRR, disaster risk reduction, requires a multi-hazard approach and an inclusive risk-informed decision-making based on the open exchange and dissemination of disaggregated data, including by sex, age, and disability, as well as on the readily available, up-to-date, comprehensible, science-based, non-sensitive risk information complemented by traditional knowledge. We have to be very aware of that. Complemented by, we need complement. Indigenous people, that's another mention, through their experience and traditional knowledge, provide an important contribution to the development and implementation of plans and mechanisms, including for early warning. There are more I can mention, but I won't, because we have to talk about many other things, and you will probably get bored if I go through all these sections. In any case, it is mentioned explicitly in various places, and it's fully recognized as something we have to build upon. And you may ask yourself, why is it important actually that the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction makes concrete reference to traditional knowledge? Why is the Sendai framework important? Well, some people might say, well, it's just a framework, an international framework. I don't know, politicians for some decision-making processes, but many practitioners maybe don't know the Sendai framework yet or don't care too much. Well, if we look at the Sendai framework and how it was conceived and taken up, we have to remind that it sets the tone on the international level, and it does a very good job to take into account a lot of important aspects we need to take into account to do more effective disaster risk reduction. And this new framework, the Sendai framework, which is the successor of another one, which was called the Hyogo framework, is more in line, more in touch with the current reality, with new insights. So it is very important. And it is important here to remember that it was a framework that was worked out internationally by a lot of countries, almost 170 countries, governments, also NGOs, practitioners, experts, a lot of people. So we can be sure that there is a realistic degree of consensus of what we need to look at this and the next decade, and that's important. There's only one problem with the standard framework, maybe more, but at least this problem is very important as a framework, but it doesn't say how to do things. So we can say it's important. It's like almost being, with a doctor who says, well, you got to take care of your health, you got to eat well, you exercise, whatever, you got to do things to make your health better. But it's very hard to change things and to actually know how to do that. So we have this tool, for instance, that Rojit mentioned, the words into action. And that is a tool that precisely tries to take these things, these ideas from the standard framework and put them into a more concrete context, trying to find a way to show how things could be done, to show alternatives of how things could be achieved in sometimes very complex themes in the interdisciplinary area of disaster risk reduction. And one of the ways we can try precisely to do that is to make sure that the knowledge we gather through a tool like Words into Action is varied enough that it comes from different sources, that it doesn't only rely on, let's say, a few well-recognized experts or one or two academic institutions or a few very smart consultants. No, it has to be much more democratic. It has to talk to the minds and hearts to many, many, many people in many different regions and places with many different realities and many different kind of problems in disaster risk reduction. So that is exactly what Words into Action tries to do. It is based on trying to translate often complex concepts that come also from the standard framework into concrete teachings, into concrete ideas and suggestions that can be important, that can give a good hint to people that want to know more about that area. And what we really like to focus on is that what we try to do here is to try to contribute to create resilience and opportunities to know and manage risk better, and to have the chance to ensure worldwide expertise there in the Words into Action talking to us. Expertise that comes from practical sources, academic sources, experiential sources, and also networks of DER practitioners. And as I said, what we try to make sure that happens with the Words into Action is that they become pragmatic roadmaps that merge cross-sectoral and cross-regional expertise and practice, like policymakers, technical working groups, international organizations, local organizations, non-governmental organizations, and everyone who is interested in DRR. I know that's a lot of words, but it's meant to be actionable, precisely. The Words into Action on traditional knowledge, we hope will provide a handle on how to look at problems in DRR, disaster risk reduction, from another angle, and teach us a lot more about the democratization of knowledge, in which other ways of seeing and interpreting the world around it will actually be welcomed and not be put aside because it's maybe not a formalistic or a positivistic approach. That for us is very, very important. And in this regard, we should never, 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 ever forget that traditional knowledge doesn't mean the same as old or static. Of course, it can be very possible. Some of it is, but it certainly is not that. It's very often actually the complete opposite of that. We have to take that into account. And we have to remember for that also, extremely important, that the cognitive schemes that lie at the basis of many traditional knowledge that are generation have been very different. They come from different ways of interpreting and living with the world. Different people throughout history and also currently, of course, use other different ways of how to observe and to gather information, how to interpret it and share it. And there's so much for us to learn, especially important in disaster risk reduction. Now, we also want to make sure that we can talk to the, let's say, classical scientific community to see how we can use traditional knowledge better, not only specific methods or things that have worked very effectively in the past, but also precisely to see how traditional knowledge can help democratize sharing and generation of knowledge. That's very important, and it's not easy. How can we try to complement current scientific practical, let's say, research and insights with the insights that can come from traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge? That is not easy. And we have seen similar, let's say, situations when we started to talk with, let's say, the climate adaptation, climate change adaptation community. It's very important, but it takes time, it takes effort, and there's different languages that the different communities speak, groups, experts. So it will really need a directed effort to do this, and to make sure that we can find a way to feed from traditional knowledge in an effective manner. Something else I would like to mention is that we think it's very important that the way that traditional knowledge is often generated comes with an attitude very often and a respect towards nature and ecology and environment that can also bring so much to the table that we need to take into account to have more holistic, more systemic, more encompassing and effective disaster risk reduction strategies and solutions for the future. And I would further also like to mention that, and my colleagues in the webinar certainly refer to that, that traditional actually can become groundbreaking. People think traditional is at all? No, it can be groundbreaking. And a lot of very good stuff, very good experiences that we can refer to has disappeared or suffered because they have suffered under what we could call kind of a dominant culture wave of what the positivistic kind of science making is in practice. So that is something that we have to remember. And we are very happy to be part of this Words into Action work that we're doing with Roger's team, and many partners are participating in the Words into Action tool. And we don't only want this to be a publication. We want this to be also a tool for engagement. And we will work on that very intensively. Thank you for your attention, Roger. Thank you for giving me time and space.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zevras, for pointing out to us how Sendai Framework, the key international policy on disaster risk reduction adopted in 2015, recognizes the importance of traditional knowledge. In fact, Sendai Framework is the first time cultural heritage has been given its due recognition in any international policy which is referring to disaster risk reduction. You have also aptly summarized the key characteristics of traditional knowledge and rightly stressed that current scientific approaches can help to use and share traditional and indigenous knowledge. We need to know how to use, integrate, and add to traditional knowledge rather than merely knowing what it is. And that is precisely the objective of the Words into Action guide that is being developed. Now, I'm pleased to invite our next panelist, Professor Takeyuki Okubo, Director of the Institute of Disaster Mitigation for Urban Cultural Heritage at Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Japan. So over to you, Professor Okubo, for your presentation.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Jigasu. So hello, so ladies and gentlemen. So I will start my sharing the screen now. Was it okay? Okay, so today, I would like to discuss about this effective fire spread mitigation by traditional knowledge, such as group of trees in Japanese historic district. So most of you may know about that the Japanese traditional buildings are built by wood and paper, and also the historic town are always faced to the risk of fire. So maybe because of that, those resources of fire mitigation should be succeeded within the long history of disasters. So we have some typical examples. One is some mud plastered storehouses, and also some of the group of trees. So today we don't have enough time to discuss all about that, so that I will target on the group of trees. And in case of Japan, most of those trees are owned by the private owner. But in the same time, it says that it can delay the speed of spread. So the purpose of this research is here. So I will try to modeling of trees in mathematical simulations to express the trees in physical spread prediction model, and also try to estimate of effects of spread control using these simulations. So it can be shows a scientific estimation of spread control performance by group of trees. Then we hope to solve the compatibility with value conservation and also the risk mitigation. In most cases, fire disaster risk mitigation should need some kind of the change of the structure of buildings or material of buildings. It can be a risk for the authenticity. But if we can utilize those kind of the natural trees as sort of measures, it should be quite important. So today I target in the two types of group of trees. One is in Tonakijima Historic District, and in that case, it's a southern Japanese island. They have the residential forest surrounding each houses, mainly against the typhoon and so on. And another target is Kanayamachi Historic District. So it's a continuous courtyards trees. So in most cases, the Japanese traditional historic city, we have a Machiya townhouse, which have a similar plan in the mid-city area. And so each of small lot have their own private small courtyard with greens. But in the scene of the mid-city, so it can be a continuous green barrier each by each. So estimation of two major different case studies can show the general effect of spread control by traditional trees. And I just show you about the outcomes. Here is the outcomes of Tonakijima district and the estimation in city scale by Monte Carlo simulation we use. So you can see the risk from red color risk to the green color. It means more safer than before. So that if we lose the existing residential forests in the Tonakijima situations, maybe the risk of fire should be higher than before. So risk of spread speed is reduced in total to keep the traditional residential forest by residential peoples. And next one is the outcomes of the Tonakijima, so Kanayamachi district. So we try to estimate in the block scale and calculation of spread motion in each step of 10 minutes. So we can detect more in detail of the motion of the spreading situations. And even in cases of outcomes, we found that effectiveness of spread control by continuous trees in group of private courtyards are revealed. So this is a summary and discussion. So simulation in city scale, by the simulation of in city scale, we found that spread risk are increasing in both of target sites if each traditional trees are lost. And second, simulation in block scale, we found the spread control effect by group of private courtyard trees is confirmed. So if we can rehabilitate trees lost in past, so resilience and redundancy against fire spread are expected. So it should be important to maintain those traditional trees in a good condition for fire risk control. Lastly, so I would like to discuss about my key message. So traditional knowledge as conservation of group of trees means, of course, the conservation of cultural landscape and mitigation of disaster risk. And also it can rehabilitate the natural environment. So to conserve the private trees as a part of community's property is quite important for also for the disaster risk mitigations. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And if you need more detailed information, so please visit our institute named Disaster Mitigation for Urban Cultural Heritage. So thank you again, and I'm very looking forward to discuss later.
Thank you very much, Professor Kubo. Through your presentation, you very powerfully showed us the holistic nature of traditional knowledge. Planting of trees not only helps in preventing spread of fire, but also helps in conservation of cultural landscape and rehabilitation of natural environment. So this is a big message for all of us that we must keep in mind as we try and use traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction. Now I have the pleasure of requesting Dr. Ebru Genza, Executive Director of the Center for Urban Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience, to make her presentation. So over to you, Ebru.
Thank you very much, Rohit. Let me open my presentation. Thank you very much again, Rohit, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. In this Words into Action guide, I contributed to traditional planning and construction for DRR, and today I'll present some of these examples of traditional practices in the built environment, as well as what happens when traditional practices collide with improper application of modern materials and technologies. And I will conclude the presentation with some recommendations for using traditional practices in the contemporary context. I would first like to bring attention that a traditional knowledge of the built environment is not static. Throughout history, communities have been exposed to a variety of hazards, and they have continuously modified and adapted their environment, evolving their practices with trial and adaptation. In ancient Mesopotamia, to avoid the extremes of desert and fen, residents have developed irrigation ditches and canals and embanked their dwelling places. Spiro Kostov writes about the inhabitants of the Netherlands adapting to the extremes of the nature they had settled in, predating the Roman occupation, battling the fury of the sea and the flooding of the rivers, building dikes of historic proportions, claiming tidal marshes ready for settlement. And of course, with trial and adaptation, those dikes have changed over the centuries, as you see in this figure. In settlements that have been prone to natural hazards, trial and adaptation led to the development of varied local construction styles using local materials. For instance, in Japan, the traditional architectural craftsmanship used in timber frame structures, including the Japanese cypress bark used in roofing, is found to enhance the resilience of buildings to earthquakes and typhoons. This craftsmanship was recently accepted to UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. To give an example from traditional knowledge for planning for DRR, again in Japan, for centuries, tsunami stone markers have been used in the coastline, warning residents to settle below that level due to the tsunami danger, which was unfortunately not followed in Tohoku, as was experienced in the 2011 earthquake and tsunami disaster. However, on the high hills of that region, the village of Aneoshi was saved from the tsunami when the high waves stopped just 300 feet below. High dwellings ensure the peace and happiness of our descendants, writes in the tsunami stone of Aneoshi. This village had first moved its dwellings uphill after the 1896 tsunami, which had left only 2 survivors. Aneoshi was repopulated and moved back to the shore a few years later, only to be devastated again by another tsunami in 1933. After that, the village moved uphill for good, and the tsunami stone was placed, saving the village again from another tsunami in 1960 prior to the one in 2011. Despite the existence of local knowledge of the built environment, in the recent decades, demands of modernization and urbanization, adopting cheaper building materials and techniques, and lack of craftsmanship have caused the hesitation of the use of traditional techniques and materials, or consulting to local knowledge for settlements. Ilan Kalman writes about how in the Pacific Islands, the islanders learned to remove traditional roofs as a storm approach because they were constructed with that purpose in mind, as used as shelter on the ground. Jessica Mercer describes how, on the other hand, the housing in Papua New Guinea had become more vulnerable to hazards due to the use of modern materials, which are used by many villagers because such materials represent wealth and higher social status. According to Mercer, traditionally, houses in Barrio are built with steeply sloping roofs, reducing potential for collapse and fire due to volcanic ash. With modern materials, iron sheeting is particularly popular for roofs. Although the iron sheeting reduces fire risk, volcanic ash does not slide off as easily, leading to possible collapse. The improper mix of traditional and modern presents much of the vulnerability in the Pacific Islands today. For instance, the use of nails without proper strapping, or the use of iron corrugated sheet roofs without adapting to the strength of the buildings. Mixing this modern material with traditional vine straps that are normally used for leaf roofs. This Words into Action guide also gives examples of the impact of modernization, urbanization, and the improper use of techniques in the more urban contexts, for instance, in the post-earthquake investigations in Algeria, Haiti, and Morocco. Following the research of Joel Otfroy in Haiti, we learned that in the 2010 Haiti earthquake, in addition to modern and conventional structures, some vernacular structures built of wattle and dough, a technique called as clissage in Haiti, also failed to resist earthquake due to the poor quality of materials used. However, Otfroy also writes that an inspection of regions around Port-au-Prince revealed several examples of good quality traditional constructions that properly use the clissage technique and responding much better to the earth movements. Again, another traditional construction system that resisted well to earthquakes was the wooden homes with the traditional thin sloped roofs and walls formed by horizontal and wooden boards. In this system, roofs are generally made of corrugated sheets that do not add weight to the construction. On the other hand, they also offer little resistance to the hurricanes, which also reminds us the importance of considering multi-hazard scenarios in also traditional building and construction. Otfroy states that over the last decades in Haiti, production of traditional housing has fallen due to economic factors, as wood had become expensive and its quality deteriorated. In addition, subjective perception of the use of traditional materials, as the modern materials are considered to be the optimal solution for housing constructions, even though some of their specifications are not applicable in all climatic regions. I would like to end with discussing some ways to incorporate traditional knowledge in the contemporary built environment. First, I would like to stress the importance of awareness raising, informing of the policymakers, as this Words into Action guide aims to do. In addition, it's very important to educate the next generation built environment professionals of the existence and importance of these traditional methods. Here I would like to show a photo from my student, Taylor Haida, who recently finished her thesis on integrating traditional knowledge in international development projects in the Pacific. We need to provide more opportunities in the architecture and planning programs for students to learn and explore these subjects. Other recommendations include working with and learning from local cultures and documenting traditional knowledge and techniques, increasing craftsmanship by training and financing these programs, teaching proper ways to incorporate traditional methods with modern materials. Borrowing from Joel Freud, we should also find ways to integrate modern and traditional materials and techniques for low-cost, climate adaptability, and optimal impacts. And finally, I think it's very important to recognize local materials and techniques in code of practice, supporting residents' access to finance and insurance, as a failure to address local techniques has been an impediment to the improvement and adaptability of these traditions in the contemporary context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abru. Thank you very much. Through various examples, you clearly showed that we have tremendous wealth of traditional knowledge accumulated in traditional construction and planning practices. Unfortunately, these are rapidly getting lost and degraded due to various factors, as you mentioned in your speech. However, we need to encourage experimentation and innovation for adapting this knowledge to contemporary built environment, as your last slide aptly showed. So thank you again for this very powerful message that you conveyed in your presentation. Now I request Dr. Robert Saki Roglic, postdoctoral research associate at King's College London, to share his views, which are based on his recently accomplished doctoral research. So over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Rohit, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak in today's webinar. So as Rohit pointed out, my intervention today is based on the results of my PhD research, which focused on the role local knowledge plays in community-based disaster risk reduction in Malawi. So as Dave mentioned, the importance of local knowledge is recognized in global policies. So the Sendai makes a reference to it, substantive reference to it, Paris Agreement makes reference to it for climate change adaptation. But as we're all aware of, policies are one thing and their actual and respective implementation on the ground is something completely else. So in my intervention today, I want to share some thoughts of why is this so when it comes to local knowledge and disaster risk reduction. So part of my PhD dealt with this, and I really wanted to understand through a lens of stakeholders that are actively working with local communities impacted by flooding in Malawi. So I engaged in discussions with representatives of the government, of international and national NGOs, donors, flood risk consultants, and I tried to understand what are the challenges that they are experiencing when engaging with local knowledge, which leads to it being underutilized in the mainstream DRR practice, let's put it that way. So what are some of the challenges that I have heard of? So the kind of the overwhelming challenge for these stakeholders, they felt that the local knowledge lacks evidence for its effectiveness. And by the evidence, they primarily refer to scientific evidence. They thought that generating evidence was much needed to recognize local knowledge as a valid form of knowledge for disaster risk reduction. And they expressed concerns that the overall DRR system prefers solutions which have been kind of proven to work. And without this type of evidence, it will be difficult to mainstream local knowledge in the wider DRR practice. Also, what I've seen is that some of the core characteristics of local knowledge were seen as a challenge for its wider usage. For instance, the fact that local knowledge is spatially confined. It's different between different locations, but can also mean different things between different locations. And because of this spatial heterogeneity, accessing and understanding local knowledge was seen as time and resource intensive. Also, local knowledge is often not documented. And these stakeholders have seen this as a challenge, as it also means they cannot easily access it once when in the community. We're aware that within the community, different people have different local knowledges, and local knowledges are used differently by different community members. So this heterogeneity in knowledge possession and use was also seen as hindering the wider implementation of local knowledge in DRR, as it again requires time and resources to engage with. Another challenge was the accuracy and applicability of local knowledge. By accuracy, for instance, when early warning indicators such as behavior of animals are whether they're really accurate in prediction of flooding, and applicability in terms of whether local knowledge is really applicable for different magnitudes and frequencies of hazards. And finally, a challenge that these stakeholders identified are just wider changes to local knowledge brought about by climate change, by environmental degradation, and interestingly, the changes brought in by penetration of new approaches and technologies, which do come at the expense of local knowledge. So these were some of the narratives that were coming out of the engagement with these stakeholders. And what I think is they kind of tell us two reasons why local knowledge remains underutilized in DRR in practice. First of it is due to the way that the system functions. So the projects on the ground are mostly short-term and with predefined objectives, which allows really for little flexibility when it comes to the inclusion of local knowledge. And it also allows for very little time, which is needed if we are really to understand the breadth and wealth of local knowledge and, and its heterogeneity. It connects also very well with the lack of resources, which is an issue, coming also out of the status quo. But another aspect emerging, which I think is really interesting, and that serves as an explanation why local knowledge is not fully utilized, is just the prevailing attitudes towards local knowledge. It was obvious that local knowledge is seen as valid only when it fits into the scientific frames of understanding, which means that it is still marginalized and unfortunately still largely given only lip service. For instance, I heard numerous times that the way forward for a wider inclusion of local knowledge is through integration of knowledges, which is expected and definitely a way forward. But the way that integration was envisioned as purely validating local knowledge by scientific knowledge, again implies this strong dichotomy that's present on the ground, and it implies a strong supremacy of scientific knowledge. So what would be some of the ways to overcome these challenges? There are no straightforward and simple ways. I think part of it really lies in a practical challenge and in a practical change to the way we do projects on the ground and the way we do community engagement. There needs to be a shift towards longer time frames, which would allow enough time and resources to truly engage with communities and different groups within a community and different individuals within a community, because these are not monolithic entities. So that would allow for space and time for local knowledge to be better comprehended, understood, and utilized. I know it's much easier to say it than done. And then in addition, a need for co-production approaches, which will be based on different types of knowledge being equal and with equal contribution. I think, the increasing focus on co-production is excellent, but there is a long way to go, both in terms of academically understanding what the ideal approach to co-production is, if there is such a thing, and then what will be even more challenging, how to make sure to integrate this in the practice. Thanks a lot, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you very much, Robert. You clearly brought out the challenges experienced by various stakeholders when engaging with local knowledge. It's crucial to understand these bottlenecks and address these while we try to find ways of making traditional knowledge useful in the present context. You have also very rightly advocated that overcoming these challenges would require practical changes to the way we do projects on the ground and the way we engage with communities. I think this is a very important lesson that comes out of your presentation. Thank you again. And our next panelist is Dr. Elena Isaev, Professor of Ancient History and Place at Exeter University, UK. So welcome, Lena.
Thank you very much, Rohit. I'm just going to share my screen. First of all, I just want to say how grateful I am to Rohit Jigasu and also for the Words Interaction colleagues for our opportunity to work together and also showcase the role of Indigenous and traditional knowledges. And in my particular case, I will be looking at the way it helps to counter displacement. I'm going to focus on two specific things, very briefly, on the way it provides coping mechanisms, particularly in forced displacement and in camps, but also maybe more lengthy about how it counters such displacement in the first place, even where actual relocation may be inevitable. So first of all, as we've already seen, no two cases are the same, and yet Indigenous and traditional knowledges in their commitment to community values and collective goods, a deep-rooted understanding of the environment and the climate patterns, with embedded frameworks of adaptability and flexibility gained through experience over generations, and that includes mobility as one mode of ensuring sustainable lives, are actually uniquely positioned in countering displacement. So as you will, I'm sure a lot of you will well know, that recent reports show that in most regions, the main cause of displacement is due to climate disasters. And contrary to common belief, such displacement is not short-term, but increasingly protracted. And this means that the trauma and the stress may be endured by people over lifetimes. This is more difficult for those communities who do not have full rights or protective status and struggle to access even the most basic services as electricity, water, and even a place to build their shelter. So for example, the Palestinians who live in refugee camps in Burj al-Barajni, set up in 1949 near Beirut, still rely on makeshift structures, including, for example, the wire networks that you might see in the top image here. Or the refugees who live outside of camps, as in Ma'ashuk gatherings near Tyre in Lebanon, they draw on informal traditional institutions for meaningful lives to continue. And these are not codified by laws necessarily, but by binding social agreements. And they employ, for example, the popular committees that help and negotiate access to their basic services. What needs to happen is that there needs to be recognition of the work of such informal processes where others are lacking. For example, in granting popular committees a more representative status in civil, even if not in political realm. This would improve the situation of a significant part of Lebanon's Palestinian refugees. The ability to cope with such daily life, and in addition to seek and provide support for trauma, for example, depends on a very complex relationship between culture and healing. And displaced people develop their own coping mechanisms, as expressed through such terms as sumud, which is used by Palestinian refugees, meaning steadfastness, or the ability to suffer and yet persist where there's no political solution in sight. So external models of individually focused trauma diagnosis, such as, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder and other forms of biomedical therapy, as those that were employed in Sri Lanka in the aftermath of conflict and the 2004 tsunami, may undermine strategies of coping and add to the stigmatization through pathologizing individuals. Instead, what is proposed is health pluralism, which gives value to traditional healers and healing practices, which combine collective methods towards recovery. But displacement is not always possible to prevent in situations of conflict and disaster. But even where moving is necessary, it need not result in conditions of displacement and refugeeness. An understanding of hazards allows for informed decisions as to when continuing to inhabit a particular settlement becomes too much of a risk, which is something that's actually just been mentioned in the last presentation. It comes from such deep-rooted knowledge as that of the tribes of the Arctic region. And in their letter to the National Science Foundation last March, they write, "We have unparalleled firsthand experience living in and with and knowing the Arctic environment. As such, we have many of our own research questions." And I think this is some of the co-production, meaningful co-production you were just talking about. And these, and I continue, these are practical and address our biological, ecological, social, and economic interests and concerns from the perspective of our own worldviews and cosmologies. And this includes an expansive definition of, for example, the meaning of infrastructure. So at the very introduction, we heard about a new way of understanding language, and this fits into that. And it's not just infrastructure, but also tracking threats to it. So they note in the letter that we relied on ice for transportation, for the structural integrity of our buildings, for the procurement of our food, for our livelihoods, and for our culture. Sea ice and permafrost are forms of infrastructure. So its destruction is that well of other infrastructure, such as electricity and roads, through erosion, flooding, melting, sea ice, and thawing permafrost, have severely affected numerous communities and also those across Alaska. Among these are the homes marked here by those brown houses that you can see on the map, are of the Yupik community in Nutok, and further north of the Inupiat community of Shishmaref. Both of these communities have made extremely difficult decisions to move their villages. Relocation may be the last resort, but it need not become displacement. The historical context of forced relocations of Indigenous peoples emphasizes the need for relocation frameworks that protect self-determination and proactive efforts on the part of federal and state and local governments to alleviate institutional barriers. For the community of Newtok, the site of eventual relocation that took decades to see through is across the river in Metarvik, about 10 miles away, where the new homes and infrastructure is being constructed. In Shishmaref, there is a loss of shoreline. In Shishmaref, there have been decades of federal studies and assessments without a move, and the feasibility of Ear Mountain is to report in this coming fall of 2021. But in the meantime, there is a loss of shoreline iceberg, and meaning earlier hunting and gathering and reliance on important and processed food, which has the danger of increasing precarity and dependence, which are some of the main characteristics of displacement. As Richard Kuzuk, Shishmaref's environmental coordinator, who we saw on the first slide, said, the alternative is emergency evacuation, which is a matter of when, not if, at the rate of erosion. Such a disaster would likely mark the end of Shishmaref as an independent village. From 2002 on, the community members' unanimous desire is to remain a discrete rural village upon relocation within traditional subsistence territory, even if it has to be on the mainland, where human ecological relationships can be carried out in familiar habitual ways. To move as individuals to nearby urban sites and other villages is not an option. Hence, while some state and federal entities see voluntary buyout programs as the most promising funding options for facilitating relocations, these are ill-suited because of their focus on individual households instead of community-wide relocations. Traditional knowledge incorporates change and adaptation, including mobility, even spending time in cities. But this is not the same as shifting people's sense of home and belonging. Acts of social and cultural flexibility and fluidity between spaces only work if there is a Shishmaref community to return to and interact with. Anouk Olin of Shishmaref emphasizes the obstacles for Indigenous people to redesign and rebuild their communities. For example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency does not qualify erosion as a natural hazard eligible for funding because, by definition, it's a gradual process. But what she's saying is we're not seeing erosion in Alaska or gradual erosion. What's happening here is much more catastrophic. Waves batter our villages, massive coastal flooding penetrates the soil that holds the permafrost, and the combination results in destabilization. And meaningful engagement with Indigenous knowledges and communities needs alleviation of obstacles to adaptation, such as a limited capacity to implement adaptation strategies, limited access to traditional territory and resources, and limitations of existing policies, programs, and funding mechanisms. And I think also the earlier presentation we heard, which mentioned the insurance policies, partly ties into that. So just to end, this means that even when relocation or migration is the chosen adaptive strategy, a process that prioritizes communal values such as cultural heritage, collective goods, and sympathizes with fragile balance between nature and society, allows for preservation of unity, coherence, in villages, community, and culture, and prevents displacement. So thank you very much for listening.
This was indeed a very insightful presentation, Lena. While we value traditional knowledge that is rooted in certain contexts, you showed us how it can be also helpful in coping with trauma and countering displacement, especially for Indigenous communities who are threatened with losing their homes due to climate change. Here we need to recognize that these communities may perceive threats very differently than formal organizations, and therefore it is important that knowledge and perception of Indigenous communities are given due recognition. So thank you very much again, Elena, for this presentation. And now, last but not the least, it's indeed an honor to have with us Dr. Marjorie Balaes, who belongs to Indigenous Kankanai community of the Philippines. We often listen to outsiders speaking about traditional knowledge of Indigenous communities. Now, let's listen to the understanding of this knowledge from someone to whom this knowledge truly belongs. So over to you, Marjorie.
Namwag Rohit, Yasigad ay masdum ta ko amin. Thank you so much, Rohit, and good evening, everyone. So let me just share my screen. Yeah, there you go. So my sharing is about the typhoon early warning systems of the indigenous Kankanai people in the northern Philippines and how these deconstruct the binary between indigenous and scientific knowledge in disaster risk reduction. This case study is a part of a critical ethnography that I did with my own indigenous community for my PhD project. Let me just show you the geographical context of the case study. So that's the map of the Philippines, and the indigenous Kankanai people are located on the northern part of the country. Welcome everyone into this virtual bonfire session. The Kankanai evening bonfire sessions are spaces of solidarity and dialogue by which the indigenous Kankanai people come together and talk about their issues and concerns, and where they come up with the decision making with regards to those issues and concerns. It is also a space where knowledge, indigenous knowledge in particular, are constructed and passed down orally through generations. So at times, the presence of fire elders or the traditional elders are actually required during evening bonfire sessions, as they're gonna be the one to provide wisdom and guide the construction of knowledge by those who participate in the bonfire sessions. And traditionally, the Kankanai bonfire sessions are exclusive to members of the community, but as time evolved, bonfire sessions are actually more inclusive to include participants coming from the outside. So particularly in the case of knowledge construction for disaster risk reduction, the bonfire sessions provide the opportunity for outsiders, meaning scientists, people from the government, and also other professionals, as well as the insiders or the indigenous people themselves, to come together and sit and come up with approaches and construct knowledges that would make the community more resilient to hazards and disasters. So the contemporary indigenous Kankanai knowledges and responses to disasters, specifically for typhoons, are actually a combination of indigenous and outsiders' perspectives. Now, in terms of engaging the indigenous peoples with a meaningful dialogue in the construction of knowledge for disaster risk reduction, it is important to understand and appreciate indigenous people's deep sense of relationship with the environment or with nature in general. So it actually calls for a recognition of indigenous people's kinship with the environment. And this sense of kinship with the environment has provided a ground, or it has become an anchor for indigenous peoples to construct their knowledge and practices in relation to disaster risk reductions and particularly typhoons. And the same knowledge and practices alongside indigenous ethics and values also leverage these indigenous people's relationship or kinship with their environment. However, with the advent of modernization and development, there have been changes in the physical, social, and cultural landscapes of indigenous people's daily lives. And these changes in their daily lives have affected the way they relate with their natural environment, such that natural hazards and the natural processes taking place within their environment has been framed as disasters. For example, natural hazards, in the case of typhoons, has been seen as an extraordinary event or has been seen as disasters that require technological and highly advanced scientific responses. And this has resulted to the disenfranchisement of Indigenous knowledge and practices in disaster risk reduction, and unfortunately reified and essentialized the binary between Indigenous and scientific knowledges in disaster risk reduction. And without access to these highly advanced scientific and technological responses to disasters, this has increased the vulnerabilities of Indigenous peoples to the impacts of hazards and disasters. However, with Indigenous peoples' continuing interaction with their environment, with the changes within their environment and with the external world, they have developed an integrated approach that incorporates Indigenous and scientific knowledges as a form of responses for typhoons. So such is the case for the Indigenous Kankanai people in the Philippines. For their typhoon early warning systems, they have come up with an integrated approach that looks into a combination of Indigenous and scientific knowledge in responding to typhoons. And as the elders have emphasized, this integrated approach needs to recognize the social and economic factors to vulnerabilities and the need to respond to this. So it does not only look at the physical or the environmental factors to vulnerabilities of Indigenous peoples, but more so it emphasizes on the social and economic factors of these vulnerabilities and the need to respond to these vulnerabilities. Because Indigenous peoples believe that only, and that is particularly amongst the Kankanai people, that only through recognizing and responding to the social and economic factors to vulnerability that Indigenous resilience can be truly achieved. And in terms of Indigenous resilience, the Indigenous Kankanai people look at it as a whole, so that their typhoon early warning systems are not only there as a means of a response, but it incorporates and highlights the need for mitigation practices. And that is why they have sustaining practices such as ensuring food security and securing livelihood for people and their communities, and make sure that disasters do not happen in the first place. So this is an example of how the integrated Kankanai typhoon early warning systems work. This is a conversation between a mother and her son. So first, the mother makes use of Indigenous knowledge by reading the signs of the heavenly bodies and also understanding the changes within her environment. And then at the same time, shifts to scientific knowledge, that is turning on the radio for weather forecast to confirm or to complement her reading of her natural environment. And then if we look at the response of the son when asked to turn on the radio, he says there that I will tell my friend to tell about this to his mom. So it does not end from that family alone, preparing for an upcoming typhoon or bad weather, but there is the element of a collective, involving the whole community and emphasizing on a collective response, involving people in the early warning system. And the mother responds and says, she's going to collect or harvest the cucumbers in the field to share with the neighbors. So there is again the element there of collective, building collective resilience and involving people, such that the typhoon early warning system also recognizes the spirit of social justice and collective, as I've mentioned, collective resilience. So from my presentation, the case study actually provides that there is a possibility for the integration of scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge as a disaster risk reduction response, particularly for typhoon early warning systems. And as mentioned by my colleagues earlier, the integration process is not easy. There are challenges, there are tensions. Indigenous and scientific knowledge may not always go together. They are not always compatible. However, there are also opportunities and possibilities by which indigenous and scientific knowledge can come together. And this involves responding to the issues of power and power relations, particularly in the integration process. I mean, as mentioned earlier, it is not easy. It may actually be that the integration would reinforce the binary. However, as shown by the case study, the integration process that we're talking about here also provides an example of how a people-led integration process can happen. So it comes as a natural process into their community, like the processes that takes place in the bonfire sessions. The integration process can also happen naturally amongst and by the people themselves. And that is specifically when certain conditions are met and honored in the integration process, and emphasizing that power and power relations need to be addressed in this integration process. And also, I'd like to mention here, and this is on behalf of my elders and my community, that it is very important to always engage the traditional elders in this integration process as keepers of knowledge, as holders of knowledge in indigenous communities. Their participation is essential. At times, they do not come and participate in formal workshops or integration processes, but there is a need to reach out to them and seek their wisdom and their knowledges, because this is a form of a relational bridge that opens further dialogue between scientific knowledge systems and power. So it's a possibility for really engaging indigenous peoples and making their experiences meaningful in the integration of indigenous and scientific knowledges in disaster risk reduction, and that would eventually inform policies and programs that could concretize this integration of indigenous and scientific knowledges and disaster risk reduction. Thank you so much. Namwao.
Thank you very much, Marjorie, for very inspiring and enlightening presentation. You explained to us fascinating aspects of indigenous knowledge of your community that is so closely intertwined with nature and gets embedded through social relationship and practices that contribute to solidarity. Through the case of Kankanai Typhoon early warning system, you demonstrated very clearly the importance of integrated approach that combines indigenous and scientific knowledge. So a lot of lessons to take away from your presentation. Let me once again thank all our panelists for the stimulating presentations. And before I take up questions from the audience, I would like to actually pose a question to all the panelists and request them to respond very briefly. So may I request all the panelists to switch on their cameras? Thank you very much. So the question that I would like to pose to each one of you is, based on your own knowledge and experience, can you make one recommendation on how traditional knowledge may be used for practical actions that can contribute towards disaster risk reduction in contemporary context? So that's the question that I would like to pose. How can we really make it useful? And I would like to start with Dave for his brief comments. Request you to keep your response very brief. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Roy. I can be very brief. I would like to make sure that we understand much more, and maybe Words into Action can help in that, to see precisely how we can look at more sustainable solutions in general, because solutions, as they are called, they're not really solutions very often, right, are not very integrative, not very encompassing, not very ecologically viable. So we can learn a lot about the decision and knowledge sharing and generation process. We need to learn much more on how we can apply that to many fields, not only disaster risk reduction. I also wanted to mention something I thought about, like our Marjorie mentioned also, of course, the power relations. We can learn so much from indigenous and traditional knowledge examples, and we have to go to there to learn from that and apply that to our daily lives and learn from that little by little. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Professor Kubo.
Thank you. So today we discuss about trees. So we need to use the traditional knowledge as conservation of private trees in urban areas for mitigation of fire spread, as I proved. And of course, for conservation of cultural landscape and the rehabilitation of natural environments. So it should be more important for achieving the SDGs now. But in most cases, it becomes more difficult to keep the maintenance of these traditional trees by private owners. So I believe that we need to develop some support system for rehabilitation of traditional trees as shared social infrastructure in near future. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kubo. So Dr. Ebru-Gansa.
Thank you very much, Rohit. I think one of the problems that we have learned from this presentation and in this Words into Action guide is that the lack of traditional knowledge, one of the reasons of the lack of the use of traditional knowledge is the demands of urbanization, lack of craftsmanship, and the high cost of materials. So in order to that out, it's similar to what Dave suggested, finding ways to integrate some of these techniques with lower cost modern materials for their adaptability at a larger scale, and also the financing and education and training of the craftsmanship who can use these techniques. This would be one of my suggestions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Robert?
If I would have to pick just one, I would say that traditional knowledge is our best bet for localization of whatever interventions are being implemented. It is our best bet to go from implementing something at community level to truly working with communities. But I want to say that traditional knowledge has a huge potential for enriching anything that is being proposed at community level. And I avoid the language of saying that traditional knowledge can enhance implementation of external interventions, because in my view, the latter still means we will put traditional knowledge in an inferior position as a way to enhance the implementation of something external. No, it should be seen the other way around. So say traditional knowledge can first and foremost enrich and refine anything external, and in the process help with the localization of the intervention.
Thank you very much. Professor Elena?
Yes, thank you for that, Rohit, and everyone. I have a couple of things. One, I guess, they both concern approaches in terms of policies to allow for some of the things that we're talking about and also to overcome some of these obstacles. But in terms of actually learning from Indigenous knowledge, what would be helpful, and also beyond Indigenous communities, is this notion of interdependence and the notion of not thinking individualistically or in terms of sedentary practices and exposing the very sedentary and kind of neoliberal, often individualistic practices of most policies, and also policies and nation states that ignore the notion that we are mobile beings anyway, and what that means in a more expansive way, and how mobility need not always lead to displacement. And just going from what Marjorie was saying about reaching out to knowledge holders that don't necessarily participate in forums like this, I think that is absolutely right. And how to do this is about those of us who are integrated into this, including urban environments, is to really review the policies and where the obstacles are, which a lot of the presentations have already started doing, to what I would call upstream influence. And in that letter that I cited in my own PowerPoint, what was very key is the saying that we have our own questions. So not to come with questions already pre-made, but create environments where new questions could be asked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Marjorie?
Well, as an Indigenous person myself, I would say that it's my thinking about the application of Indigenous knowledge is that it provides for a sustainable relationship in communities and offers a meaningful and just relationships between people and between their environment and nature in general. That's a sustaining kinship between nature and humans.
Thank you very much. So thank you to all of you for your very pointed response to this question. I think we carry a lot of food for thought. Now we have received many interesting questions and comments. Though due to limited time, it won't be possible for us to take up all of them. Nevertheless, I would like to pose some of these questions to our panelists. So if you have, if you still have some more questions, you can type it in. type them in. So let me pose some questions that we have received already. So Professor Kubo, there's a question for you. Is there a suggestion that the sighting of trees in urban areas was based on a traditional understanding of spread of fire? Or is there a strong history of fire management in traditional Japanese urban areas?
Okay, so thank you so much for good question. So I believe that some documents said that those forests should be developed for fire protection, but in some cases it's used as a wind barrier for keep safety inside of the buildings. So as that it depends on the situation, but we don't have any evidence from historical documents for such kind of traditional knowledge. So as that I only can do to estimate the effectiveness of those possibility of traditional knowledge using the modern technologies like today's presentation. So I don't know, so it can be a right, correct answer or not, but anyhow, so most of those kind of the residential forest should be selected in a long history of fires. So as that the most of the trees are living trees and non-flammable species from the local species. So as that of course, we don't have the evidence in history, but we should understand with the modern technologies. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. There is also just a linked question to you, and maybe you can just answer it. Is fire protection due to their way of planting or the type of trees?
Yes. So yeah, in most cases, those kind of the residential forest is a non-flammable species like ginkgo, maybe you know. So, but it's seasonally, so it lose their leaves. So as that in the Okinawa Island, they use evergreen trees to keep the performance within the whole year seasons. So so as that we should think about carefully about the species, which kind of the species of trees should be used from the history of fires and so on. So as that we need to make a research about the characteristics of the trees in the same times.
Thank you very much. For Ebru, there is a question. Most of the materials used in construction, are being restricted by the governments. So how can we translate words into action in this case?
Thank you, Rohit. This is a very good, very important question. And I think that's why we should, why this words into action guide is important, because it informs also policymakers and those professionals who are working in this field. I think that's why it's important to recognize some of these construction technologies and styles and typologies in the practice of code, in the professional practice of code. And it is very true the question that indeed some of these practices are in some countries it's even prohibited, it's not included in the practice of code, and it's, I believe, only in Peru and Nepal, maybe you know better, Rohit, that are accepted in the code. And this will actually, I think, will bring more validity to the use of techniques, and also for the residents to use these techniques, and for them to be able to access to insurance and finance for their residents.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Ebru. I think this requires a lot more effort at the policy level, as you say. So, Dave, for you, there is a comment and then there is a question. The challenge could be screening and verifying what traditional methods worked and what did not. and also devising ways and means with the aid of current technology to bring in efficiency. And thirdly, equipping communities to practice the combination of traditional and modern methods. So there are 3 points that have been brought out. So what would be your thoughts on these?
Yes, of course, to see what could be valid, that's a challenge. And that will be, in my view, a long process. Lots of stuff is not documented yet, but there are special ways of learning more about what has been done in the past, but also currently how that has adapted to current situations, because it's also interesting to see how traditional knowledge has evolved, and how current indigenous knowledge evolves and how it is being applied to changing situations. We have seen some examples of that in the presentations, but I think it will be very necessary to have a much more directed and a sustained approach to that. To make this something that we can also show, also, let's say, to the people that are not very used to thinking in the terms of traditional indigenous knowledge, more, let's say, a positivistic way of thinking, but they also have much to benefit from what we can show that has worked. Efficiency is, of course, a word that is very commonplace, mainstream, and one of the main seemingly kind of values in many places of current societies, many countries. So it's all about money efficiency and to see how we can use the resources to the best. So in that regard, we must find ways to translate that also and show some things that can also attract the attention to the policymakers that look at how to optimize current practices and to see how, for instance, investment in traditional knowledge and adapting that to current situations and current circumstances in different societies, how that can, for instance, improve the efficacy of certain and hopefully more ecologically viable solutions. I don't know if that answers your question because it's quite complicated in that regard, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Dave. So, Marjorie, there's a comment for you. So the comment is that there are so many parallels between Kankanai understandings of what will constitute resilience and that of Northern Australian Indigenous people, and the importance of social justice and empowerment. So there is a comment that there is a lot of parallel between the what is there in your community and another Indigenous community. So there is also a generic kind of comment and a question. We have documented Indigenous knowledge and perhaps it is being recognized as well, but there seems to be a gap of involvement of the Indigenous community when taking measures of disaster response, particularly displacement. And then comes an issue of promoting and encouraging communities to practice what they used to do before modernization. So it is worth looking on the influence of modernization and scientific perspectives to traditional knowledge practices. So maybe this, Lena, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is from Nima Kitasho. That is a really important question. And I think one of the issues you raise is precisely about this way of thinking traditional versus modernization. And I think someone else in the chat has also pointed that out as what do we mean by that? And one of the things we didn't really have time in the presentation so much to cover everything, but one of the things I would like to stress more is that urban practices, as far as I understand it, form very much part of the systems that Indigenous communities use. They're not counter to, they're a part of it. So it's the way that the urban is used, the way that mobility is used, which is not seen as something modern versus traditional, but it's precisely about this adaptation of flexibility. But that doesn't mean getting rid of, like some for the Shishmara village. It's not about getting rid of that and just everybody moving to the urban, because that wouldn't make sense. So in terms of things around displacement, you're right, you're absolutely right, there is this gap, but I think part of it is precisely because of this division and this mindset, both in terms of policy, but also into how some of these communities are, I guess, as a result of that policy, forced to think about their own actions. I mean, I may be wrong about that, and I would love to hear from people who are part of those communities, who are both using the urban or the non-urban, about what that means. So I hope that answers it a little bit anyway, but we have a long way to go.
Thanks, Lena. So, Dr. Robert, for you, the question is, you emphasize the importance of community engagement through your presentation, but communities are very divided, hierarchical. There are power relations in communities themselves. So, how do we address this complexity within communities when we try to engage them in this process of involving traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction?
Thanks, Rohit. I think that's a very complex question, and I think the answers are very context specific as well. So, for instance, while doing my PhD in Malawi, the way that communities were implemented were through disaster risk management committees at community levels. So, kind of a starting point and a quick fix would be making sure who is involved in the committee, and would be making sure that the power relations are taken into account, so that it doesn't, because unfortunately, very often there are these decentralized institutional structures that allow for community engagement, but unfortunately, very often it will still be elite capture because of the ways the members of these committees are selected. So this would be one of the quick wins. But I think something that requires a more of a systemic change, as I mentioned in my talk, is really rethinking the way that these projects, because participation comes as part of the project, how they're being done in terms of the time frames and in terms of just having enough space for understanding what's in the community. Time and space, and time is resources, right? Thinking allowing for this strong and extensive baselines, I think would bring a much needed change.
Thanks so much, Robert. Thank you to all of you for answering these questions. And actually, there are many more, but due to limitation of our webinar time, we will not be able to take them. There is, in fact, also a request to have presentations. So I would like to inform that the webinar recording will be available on our website, and it will be also on our YouTube page very soon. So you can always, the audience can access these presentations at their own will. Now, I would like to also mention here that ICCROM is in fact dedicated towards disaster risk management of cultural heritage through its various programs and activities that aim at capacity building, research, and advocacy for diverse target audiences from heritage, disaster risk management, environment, development, and other sectors. And of course, most importantly, local communities who are true custodians of heritage. We in fact collaborate with many universities, many research institutions, and Professor Gubo from American University is already a great collaborator for ICCROM's activities in this area. By recognizing traditional knowledge, we acknowledge the proactive and the positive role that heritage can play in building the resilience of communities. Now, before concluding this webinar, I would like to once again express gratitude to all the panelists and also our organizing team here at ICCROM that has been working always hard to bring these webinars to you under these special, exceptional circumstances. We also thank all the attendees for participating in the webinar. I can see that you all continue to stay, most of you, till the end, which is commendable. And we will, of course, as I mentioned, make this recording available on our website and on the YouTube channel. Please note that the recording of the previous webinars are also available on the ICCROM lecture series page on our website. And maybe I can request the slide for the future webinars. So information on our future webinars, as you can see here, is also made available at our website under ICCROM lecture series and other social media platforms. So thank you once again to all the panelists for your very, very useful and very powerful contribution to this webinar, and also to the audiences for staying and asking such important questions. So we really value your contribution to this event. So thank you very much for being with us, and please stay safe, and goodbye for now.